I remember the taste of ash. That is what remains most clearly after all these years, more vivid than faces or names or the color of the sky before it burned. Ash on my tongue, in my throat, coating my teeth like a second skin, the flavor of worlds ending. I have lived for 237 years since the day I should have died, kept breathing by technologies I do not understand and do not want, and still that taste returns in moments of silence. The medics say it is phantom sensation, that my augmented nervous system misfires and creates false signals. They do not understand. The ash is real. It has always been real. It simply took the galaxy this long to catch up to what I already knew in my bones. My name is Credence Vol, and I am the last living witness to the cleansing of Istvan III. Not the grand version told in the approved Imperial histories, where heroes made their stands and martyrs earned their places in the Emperor's light. I speak of the hours after, when the virus bombs had done their work, and the planet itself had learned to scream. I was a Remembrancer's assistant then, barely 23 years old, assigned to document the glory of the Great Crusade for posterity. We believed in such things once. Glory. Posterity. The idea that what we witnessed mattered beyond the moment of its occurrence. I kept careful records in those days, filled data slates with observations and imagery, cross-referenced everything against approved templates. The administratum had trained me well in the importance of proper documentation. The ship I served on, I will not speak its name, for it exists now only in classified archives, and the nightmares of those few who survived held a complement of 247 remembrancers, iterators, and their support staff. We were the memory keepers of the Imperium, charged with witnessing the Great Crusade and ensuring that future generations would know the magnitude of what had been accomplished in the Emperor's name. Such hubris seems almost quaint now. The notion that we could compress the scale of galactic conquest into words and images, that we could make sense of the senseless through the application of narrative structure. But we tried. Emperor help us, we tried. I had been assigned to document Compliance Action 485 Gamma, which was the official designation for what would later be called the Purging. Even then, even in the sterile language of imperial bureaucracy, there was something unsettling about the terminology. Purging implied contamination, suggested that what we were about to witness was not conquest but cleansing. My superior, Remembrancer Lowe, dismissed my concerns with the casual condescension of a man who had witnessed 36 worlds brought into compliance. "You think too much about the words, Credence," he said. "Focus on the images. That is what people will remember." He was right, though not in the way he imagined. The images are what I remember. The images are what will not let me rest. We achieved orbit around Istvan III on the morning of the 33rd day of the 003 M31 standard calendar. I remember the date because I had been keeping meticulous records of our voyage through the warp, noting the temporal discrepancies and attempting to calculate our actual position in real space despite the distortions of immaterial transit. Such efforts were encouraged among the Remembrancer Corps. Precision and attention to detail were considered virtues of the highest order. I had filled 17 data slates with observations by that point, everything from the efficiency ratings of the ship's plasma drives to the architectural details of the quarters assigned to visiting Astartes. I thought I was building a comprehensive record. I thought I was doing something that mattered. The planet was beautiful from orbit. That detail lodges in my memory like a splinter of glass, sharp and impossible to extract. Istvan III possessed 3 major continents wreathed in clouds that caught the light of its yellow sun, turning the atmospheric envelope into bands of gold and amber. The Coral City, the capital where millions lived and worked in service to the Emperor, gleamed like a jewel on the largest continent's eastern coast. I stood in the observation gallery with 40 other remembrancers, recording equipment arrayed before us, and watched that beauty with the detachment of someone who believed himself safe, who believed that what happened to worlds happened at a distance, mediated by sensors and data feeds, never touching the observer, never marking the soul. But there was something wrong even then, though I lacked the context to understand it. The War Master's fleet held position at high anchor, maintaining a cordon that seemed excessive for a compliant world. No ships entered or left the system. All communications channels except the primary military frequencies had been locked down under Mechanicum authority codes. When I asked Lowe about this, he suggested that security concerns must have been elevated due to enemy activity in adjacent sectors. The War Master knows what he's doing, Lowe said, and that was supposed to be the end of discussion. The War Master always knew what he was doing. To suggest otherwise was to question the very architecture of the Great Crusade itself. I should have listened to the silence. In my 2 years attached to the Remembrancer Corps, I had witnessed 6 compliance actions and 3 liberation campaigns. Each had followed predictable patterns, established protocols that structured the flow of information and the sequence of events. There were always vox chatter, fleet communications, the controlled chaos of military coordination. But over Istvan III, the communications net had gone quiet in a way that felt deliberate, surgical. Ships maintained position but spoke only in burst transmissions, encrypted beyond my ability to decode. The Astartes, who had been assigned to interface with our documentary efforts, had withdrawn, called back to their vessels without explanation. We floated in our observation galleries and viewing domes, isolated within the greater isolation of military necessity, and told ourselves that this was normal, that we simply did not understand the complexities of void warfare and planetary assault. The morning of the attack, I was in Gallery 17, reviewing footage from our previous compliance action on Rust 4. Standard archival work, the kind of task that filled the hours between moments of historical significance. The gallery was positioned on the ship's dorsal hull, offering an unobstructed view of the planetary surface below. 23 other remembrancers worked at their stations around me, the only sounds the soft clicking of cogitator keys and the occasional murmur of consultation. Lowe had gone to attend a briefing with the fleet command staff, leaving me in charge of the day's documentation efforts. I felt proud of that responsibility. I felt trusted. At 0847 hours ship time, the bombardment began. Not with the expected pattern of orbital lances and macro cannon fire that preceded ground assault, but with something else entirely. Something that made the servitors monitoring our sensor arrays emit distress pulses before falling silent. The first I knew of it was when Remembrancer Cold, stationed at the primary observation port, made a sound I had never heard a human throat produce before, something between a gasp and a sob, raw and involuntary. I crossed to his position and looked down at Istvan III. The Coral City was dying. Not in the familiar way of cities under siege, with fires spreading and structures collapsing beneath the weight of explosive force, but with a wrongness that my eyes struggled to process, even as my hands moved automatically to activate recording equipment. The atmosphere above the city had begun to change color, shifting through a spectrum that should not have been possible. Amber to yellow to a sick, phosphorescent green that seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm. The clouds were dissolving, eaten away by something invisible, leaving behind only that terrible luminescence. "What is that?" someone asked behind me. I do not remember who. All our voices had become interchangeable, united in confusion and mounting horror. "Biological agent," Cold said. His voice shook. "Life-eater virus. It's in the approved documentation for—" He stopped. The understanding of what he had just said seemed to catch in his throat like broken glass. The Coral City was not being conquered. It was being sterilized. I watched through the lens of my picked capture array as the green luminescence spread across the continent like a tide, following atmospheric currents, seeking every crevice where life might hide. The city's lights, millions of them, each representing homes and workplaces and the ordinary infrastructure of human existence, began to wink out in cascading waves. Not all at once, which might have suggested power failure, but in clusters and spirals that followed the pattern of wind dispersal. I understood then, with a clarity that felt like ice water replacing my blood, That what I was witnessing was not the death of infrastructure but the death of everything that infrastructure had been built to serve. Every person, every animal, every microbe, all the intricate machinery of biological existence, rendered into slurry and ash. The recording equipment captured it all with perfect fidelity. Later, I would discover that I had generated 347 hours of documentation during those first 6 hours of the purging, though I have no clear memory of operating the systems. My hands knew what to do. I had been trained to document, and so I documented, even as my mind recoiled from what I was seeing, even as other remembrances began to weep or vomit, or simply stand frozen at their stations. I maintained proper recording protocols. I adjusted exposure settings to compensate for the unusual luminescence. I tracked the dispersal patterns and cross-referenced them against atmospheric models. I was performing my duty, and that duty was the only anchor I had against the vertigo of comprehension. But there were things the equipment could not capture. The smell that began to permeate our ship despite the void-sealed hull and the filtration systems that should have kept us isolated from the planet below. It crept through the environmental processes like a living thing, subtle at first, then overwhelming. The scent of organic decay accelerated beyond natural processes, of proteins breaking down all at once, of millions of deaths compressed into minutes and hours. The Medicae later confirmed what we all knew. The virus was not supposed to be able to survive in void conditions. What we were smelling should not have been possible. But the War Master's weapons had moved beyond the merely possible, had achieved something that existed in the territory where science bordered on sorcery. Cold was the first to understand the full implications. He had spent 15 years documenting the Astartes legions, had accumulated more knowledge about their organization and capabilities than perhaps any civilian in the Imperium. He stood at the observation port with his hands pressed against the armor glass, and I saw the moment when the pieces came together for him. His reflection in the glass showed a face drained of color, eyes wide, with understanding that looked very much like madness. "They're killing their own," he said. The Coral City garrison was loyal. I documented their oath-taking ceremony 3 months ago. 4th Company of the... He named a legion then, one whose identity I will not repeat, for the speaking of certain truths has become treason in the centuries since. They swore allegiance to the Emperor. They were loyal. Perhaps they turned, I said, though I did not believe it even as the words left my mouth. Perhaps the War Master discovered corruption. No. Cole's voice had gone flat, effectless. Look at the dispersal pattern. Look at where the virus was deployed. Those are not strategic targets. That is complete saturation. They are not trying to eliminate military assets. They are trying to eliminate everything. I looked. I saw. And I understood that we had crossed some threshold from which there could be no return. That the Great Crusade as we had known it had ended the moment those virus bombs struck the planetary surface. The Imperium we served, the cause we had dedicated ourselves to documenting, had revealed itself to be something other than what we had believed. Not a beacon of human unity and progress spreading across the galaxy, but something darker and more terrible, capable of eating its own children with the same dispassionate efficiency it applied to alien threats. The bombardment continued for 4 hours. By the end, Istvan III's atmosphere had become a churning mass of green fire, the biological agent burning away the evidence of its own existence in a planetary-scale cremation. The continents were obscured beneath clouds of ash that had once been cities and forests and oceans, teeming with life. The recordings show that I maintained documentation protocols throughout, that my hands remained steady as I adjusted focal lengths and exposure settings. But I have no memory of conscious thought during those hours. I had become a machine, performing the function for which I had been designed, because the alternative was to acknowledge what I was witnessing and to go mad. When Lowe returned from his briefing at 1,423 hours, he found Gallery 17 in chaos. Half the remembrancers had abandoned their stations. Several were being sedated by Medicae staff, their minds having retreated into catatonia or hysterical repetition. Cold had carved symbols into his forearms with a data stylus, spiraling patterns that I later learned were fragments of text from banned philosophical works. He bled quietly at his station, still staring down at the planet below, and no one had thought to stop him. We had all been too focused on our own unraveling to notice his. Lowe looked at the recordings, his face carefully neutral, and then looked at us. I saw something in his eyes then that I would see many times in the centuries to come. The look of someone who has been briefed, who knows what is happening and why, who has already made peace with their complicity. "You will seal all documentation under classification mark Obsidian 9, he said. "Nothing leaves this gallery without authorization from Fleet Command. Anyone who discusses what we have witnessed outside of approved debriefing sessions will be subject to corrective action." The euphemism hung in the air like a threat. We all understood what corrective action meant in the context of what we had just witnessed. "Why?" I asked. The word came out hoarse, barely audible. "Why did they?" "Because it was necessary," Lowe said, and the flatness in his voice suggested that he had asked the same question and received the same answer and accepted it because the alternative was unthinkable. "The War Master knows what he's doing." But I saw his hands trembling as he gathered the data slates. I saw the way he avoided looking at the observation port at the world below that had become a monument to calculated atrocity. Whatever peace he had made, it was not complete. The cracks were there, visible to anyone who knew how to look. We were all cracking, those of us who had witnessed the purging. The question was only how long we could hold ourselves together before the fractures became chasms. They kept us in Gallery 17 for 2 more days, monitoring our behavior, administering tests to determine our psychological stability and ideological reliability. 3 remembrances were taken away for extended evaluation and never returned. Cold was sedated and confined to the Medicae Bay, deemed unsuitable for continued documentation duties. The rest of us were subjected to hours of questioning by individuals whose uniforms bore no rank insignia and whose eyes held the flat assessment of those who have learned to categorize human beings as assets or liabilities with no middle ground. I passed their tests. I do not know how, except that perhaps I had always possessed the capacity for compartmentalization that they were seeking. The ability to witness horror and continue functioning, to hold contradictory truths in simultaneous suspension and serve regardless of philosophical qualms. They asked me questions about loyalty and duty, about the difference between personal morality and imperial necessity, about whether I could continue to document the Great Crusade, knowing that its methods might sometimes conflict with idealistic notions of mercy or justice. I answered correctly. I told them what they needed to hear, and because I had maintained proper recording protocols even during the bombardment, because my documentation was thorough and technically precise, they deemed me valuable enough to preserve. They sent me back to work on the 3rd day. Gallery 17 had been cleaned and restaffed with remembrancers who had not witnessed the initial attack, who could document the aftermath without the burden of having seen the cause. I was assigned to a review detail, tasked with cataloging and indexing the accumulated documentation before it was sealed under classification protocols. For 8 hours a day, I sat in a windowless chamber deep in the ship's interior and watched recorded footage of Istvan III dying, making notes about atmospheric dispersal patterns and estimated casualty figures and the efficiency of different virus bomb delivery mechanisms. The planet's surface, when the ash clouds finally cleared enough to permit observation, had been transformed into a necropolis of such scale that it exceeded my capacity for comprehension. The coral city had become a field of organic residue, everything that had once lived reduced to a grey-brown slurry that filled the streets and plazas like obscene floodwaters. Millions upon millions of human beings, each with their own thoughts and dreams and loved ones, rendered into indistinguishable biological paste. The recordings showed it all with perfect clarity. The approved documentation guidelines required me to estimate casualty figures based on population data. I wrote numbers that looked meaningless, even as I calculated them. 7 million inches the coral city itself, perhaps 40 million across the planet, every one of them dead within hours of the bombardment beginning. But the recordings also showed something else, something that lodged in my mind like a tumor and has been growing ever since. Figures moving through the ruins. Not survivors. Nothing could have survived the Life-Eater virus, but shapes in power armor, legionaries descending to the surface in the bombardment's aftermath. I documented their arrival as required, noting unit designations and deployment patterns. But there was something in the way they moved, something purposeful and methodical, that suggested they were not simply confirming the success of the attack. They were searching for something, or perhaps ensuring that something specific had been destroyed. I flagged the footage for further review and submitted it through proper channels. 3 days later, an officer I did not recognize arrived at my station and instructed me to delete all copies of that particular section of documentation. Operational security, he said, offering no further explanation. I complied, of course. By that point, compliance had become a reflex, the only sane response to a situation that had moved beyond sanity. But I remembered what I had seen, and I began to wonder what could be important enough to send Astartes into the aftermath of such devastation, what could possibly matter amid that planetary-scale tomb. The wondering became a splinter in my thoughts, impossible to ignore, despite the danger of curiosity. During my off hours, which stretched longer and emptier as the other remembrances withdrew into trauma-induced silence, I began reviewing other sections of our accumulated documentation, not just from Istvan III, but from earlier compliance actions, from the months and years before the purging. I was looking for patterns, though I could not have articulated what I expected to find. The administratum had trained me well in data analysis and cross-referencing. I applied those skills now in ways that had not been approved, in ways that constituted a violation of my security clearances. What I found was absence. Not dramatic evidence of conspiracy or betrayal, but gaps in the record that should not have existed. Documentation that had been filed and indexed, and then quietly removed. Compliance actions where the official casualty figures did not match the preliminary estimates. Worlds where the nature of the enemy being fought shifted in the documentation without explanation, where initial reports described human resistance and final reports attributed the conflict to Xenos forces. It was subtle, visible only to someone who spent months reviewing footage and cross-referencing dates and comparing multiple versions of the same events. But it was there. The Great Crusade had been eating itself for longer than any of us had realized. Istvan III was not the beginning. It was simply the moment when the consumption became too large to hide. I began to document what I found, compiling my observations into encrypted files that I hid within innocuous portions of the ship's data architecture. It was probably the most dangerous thing I have ever done, more dangerous even than the years that followed. But I needed to believe that what I was doing mattered, that there was still a difference between blind servitude and conscious choice, that somewhere in the galaxy there might come a time when the truth of what had happened here would be necessary. So I gathered my evidence like a miser hoarding coins, each fragment a small act of rebellion against the weight of imperial necessity. The wondering about those searching legionaries became an obsession. I began analyzing their movement patterns in every piece of documentation I could access, trying to understand what they had been seeking. The official record stated that they were conducting confirmation sweeps, ensuring that no pockets of resistance remained. But their search pattern was wrong for that purpose. They were not sweeping systematically through the ruins. They were moving between specific locations, places that had been marked somehow in documentation that was now sealed beyond my access. Libraries, administrative centers, communications hubs, places where information was gathered and stored. They were destroying evidence. The realization struck me with such force that I deleted the analysis I had been working on immediately, terrified that someone monitoring my cogitating use might notice the pattern of my inquiries. They were erasing whatever had prompted the purging in the first place, removing any record of why millions had to die. The bombardment had killed the witnesses. The Astartes were killing the testimony. 6 weeks after the purging, our ship received orders to detach from the War Master's fleet and proceed to the tertiary compliance zone for reassignment. I learned later that all the Remembrancer vessels were dispersed at that time, scattered across the galaxy, to prevent concentration of witnesses and ensure that no single narrative of the events could form. We departed Istvan III with our holds full of sealed documentation and our minds full of carefully managed trauma, sent back out into the Great Crusade as if nothing had changed, as if we had not seen the architecture of Imperial power reveal its true foundation in calculated atrocity. I served for another 2 years before the truth broke containment and the heresy became general knowledge. 2 years of documenting compliance actions and liberation campaigns, while carrying the knowledge of what I had witnessed, what I had helped to document and thereby legitimize. The war that followed was vast and terrible, consuming worlds and fleets and legions in a conflagration of brother against brother, but I could not shake the conviction that it had all been inevitable from the moment those virus bombs struck the Choral city. Everything that followed was merely the logical extension of what the Imperium had already proven itself capable of. The only question had been when the killing would turn inward, not whether. The end of my service came not in battle but in bureaucratic reassignment. In the 3rd year of the heresy, the Remembrancer Corps was dissolved as a formal institution, deemed both unnecessary and potentially compromising to operational security. Those of us who remained were offered positions in various branches of the Imperial administration, our skills in documentation and analysis too valuable to simply discard. I was assigned to the Departamento Analyticus, a subdivision of the Administratum tasked with processing battlefield reports and optimizing resource allocation for ongoing campaigns. The work was supposed to be analytical and abstract, removed from the visceral reality of combat. Instead, it proved to be my final descent into the machinery of Imperial dehumanization. The Analyticus operated from a facility on a world whose name I am not permitted to speak, a fortress archive where data from across the Imperium was gathered and processed by tens of thousands of analysts working in shifts that acknowledged no distinction between day and night. I was assigned to Section Gamma 147, responsible for processing casualty reports from the Segmentum Pacificus fronts. My task was simple: receive data regarding deaths in combat, cross-reference against unit strength reports and resource allocation, produce efficiency assessments that could be used to optimize future deployments. I worked at a station identical to 3,000 others, in a chamber that stretched so far that the far walls disappeared into atmospheric haze. The work should have been numbing, should have reduced the horror of the heresy to numbers and percentages and logistical considerations. Instead, it focused my understanding with terrible precision. Every casualty report represented decisions made, resources expended, lives spent in pursuit of objectives that were themselves merely components of larger strategic calculations. I processed reports from battles where hundreds of thousands died to capture positions that were abandoned days later for tactical reasons. I calculated the resource efficiency of defensive actions where entire regiments were sacrificed simply to delay enemy advances by measured increments. I assessed the relative value of human life in void combat versus ground assault, in siege warfare versus planetary bombardment, in all the infinite permutations of how the Imperium consumed its own people in the name of survival. And I saw the pattern repeating. The same calculations that had justified Istvan III, scaled up and replicated across thousands of battlefields. The same willingness to spend lives in bulk, treating human existence as merely another form of ammunition to be expended in pursuit of victory. The heresy was being fought with the same logic that had prompted the purging, just with different parties wielding the weapons. Both sides claimed righteousness. Both sides produced documentation that framed their atrocities as necessity. Both sides generated casualty reports that I processed with the same analytical detachment, because to do otherwise was to go mad. I worked in Section Gamma 147 for 8 years. 8 years of processing death into data, of watching the war consume itself through the abstraction of numbers and logistical assessments. Other analysts burned out or requested transfer or simply stopped coming to their stations one day. The Analyticus had a turnover rate that would have been alarming if anyone in authority had cared about such things, but there were always more personnel willing or desperate enough to take the positions. I survived because I had learned the essential skill of bureaucratic horror. The ability to maintain function despite comprehension, to continue processing information that should break the human mind, because the alternative was to become one more casualty in the endless churn of attrition. But I kept my private documentation, in stolen moments between shifts, using isolated cogitators that existed in the gaps of the facility's security architecture. I continued compiling what I had learned, not just about Istvan III, but about the pattern of which it was merely an example. The Imperium had been built on calculated cruelty from its inception, on the willingness to sacrifice anything and anyone in pursuit of human survival and unification. The heresy was not a betrayal of those principles, but their logical culmination, the inevitable result of a system that had normalized atrocity in the name of necessity. Both Warmaster and Emperor had proven willing to burn worlds and populations, to spend lives with the same casual efficiency they applied to ammunition expenditure. The only difference was the banner under which the burning occurred. I had no illusions about what I was documenting or what I could possibly achieve with it. There was no higher authority to appeal to, no court of morality that could judge the actions of demigods and their servants. But I needed to believe that the act of witnessing mattered, that the creation of a record, even one that would likely never be read, was itself a form of resistance against the tide of forgetting that imperial power depended upon. So I compiled my evidence and encrypted it, and hid it within the vast data architecture of the Analyticus, a ghost in the machine of the machinery that processed death into acceptable losses. The war ended, or rather transformed into the eternal vigilance and grinding attrition that would define the Imperium for the next 10,000 years. Victory was declared, though the galaxy was shattered and depopulated and stalked by threats that the Crusade's failures had unleashed or failed to contain. I was transferred again, this time to a position in the Administratum proper, reviewing resource allocation for reconstruction efforts in devastated sectors. The work was supposed to represent hope, the rebuilding of what had been destroyed. Instead, it showed me the scale of the calculus that imperial governance required. Whole sectors were marked as strategically non-viable, their populations written off as losses not worth the resources required for relief. Worlds that had survived the heresy but been damaged beyond immediate productivity were categorized for eventual abandonment, their people left to slowly die of starvation and environmental collapse because the tithe of their salvation exceeded their expected future value to imperial coffers. I processed these assessments with the same mechanical precision I had applied to casualty reports, because that was what the system required. But each world abandoned was another Istvan III, just slower and more bureaucratic, the killing distributed across years instead of hours. I am 237 years old now, kept alive by juvenate treatments and augmetic replacement, and the simple fact that trained analysts with pre-heresy security clearances are rare enough to be valuable. I have served the Imperium for longer than most civilizations persist, have processed enough death to populate 100 worlds, have documented atrocity until it became indistinguishable from routine. The memories of Istvan III should have faded, should have been buried beneath the weight of subsequent horrors. Instead, they have grown sharper, more insistent, a foundation upon which every subsequent understanding has been built. I still taste ash. It is always there, layered beneath whatever I actually consume, a permanent reminder of what I witnessed and helped to document. The Medicae cannot explain it. My augmented nervous system shows no aberrations. The sensation persists anyway, a phantom echo of a planetary death that I experienced through sensors and recordings but never touched directly. Sometimes I wonder if it is punishment, some unconscious mechanism of guilt trying to force acknowledgement of complicity. Other times I think it might be the only real thing left, the only sensation that has not been processed and categorized and rendered into acceptable data. The documentation I compiled, The secret archive of evidence and analysis that I have spent 2 centuries building remains hidden in the data architecture of Imperial systems. I have added to it over the decades, folding in new observations and patterns as they emerge, cross-referencing events across centuries to reveal the deep structure of how the Imperium sustains itself through calculated catastrophe. It is comprehensive enough now that it could potentially provide context for thousands of purges and abandonments, and calculated sacrifices could reveal the pattern underlying 10,000 years of managed atrocity. Not that such revelation would matter. The Imperium does not operate on the basis of moral argument or historical accountability. It operates on necessity, on the grinding logic of survival in a hostile galaxy. And necessity has no conscience. But 3 months ago, something changed. I was processing resource allocation data for the Nuckman Gauntlet when I noticed an anomaly in the classification structure. Certain documents had been flagged with a priority marker I did not recognize, a code that existed outside the standard administratum protocols. When I investigated, following data connections with the same obsessive attention I had applied to Istvan III centuries ago, I discovered that someone else had been accessing my hidden archive, not destroying it or reporting its existence to security, but reading it, analyzing it, using it to cross-reference their own observations. I do not know who they are. The access patterns are masked behind security protocols more sophisticated than anything I can penetrate. But they have left markers in the data structure, subtle modifications that create new connections between my documentation and other sources I did not know existed. Other archives, other witnesses, other people who have spent centuries watching the Imperium consume itself and trying to build records of what they have seen. We are not alone, though we may never meet or coordinate or even acknowledge each other's existence directly. But we are there, distributed across the galaxy's bureaucratic machinery, like fragments of a distributed consciousness, all working toward the same goal, to create a record that survives, that persists despite every pressure toward forgetting. Yesterday, I received a data package through channels I cannot trace. It contained footage from Istvan III that I had never seen before. Documentation that should not have existed because it came from after the official record ended. Legionaries moving through the ruins, just as I had observed. But this footage showed what they found, what they destroyed. Libraries full of historical records that predated the Imperium. Communication logs showing diplomatic overtures from the garrison to both sides of the emerging conflict. Attempts to broker peace or at least understanding. Evidence that the population of the Coral City had been trying to negotiate, to find a third path between the extremes that the heresy represented. They had been killed not because they were corrupt or traitor, but because they represented the possibility of choice beyond the binary that imperial power required. They had to die so that the question they embodied, what if there is another way, could be eliminated from consideration. I do not know what I am supposed to do with this information. I have added it to my archive, encrypted and hidden and probably meaningless in any practical sense. But I understand now why I have been kept alive for 2 centuries, why my Juvenat treatments continue, and my augmetics are maintained despite my lack of unique skills or irreplaceable knowledge. I am being used. Someone in the vast machinery of imperial power knows about my documentation and is feeding me evidence, using me as a repository for information that needs to exist but cannot be officially acknowledged. I am a living archive, a witness maintained in case the testimony someday becomes necessary. The question is, necessary for what? What circumstance could possibly arise where the truth about Istvan III and 10,000 similar atrocities would be relevant? What crisis could emerge that would require the Imperium to confront the foundation of calculated horror upon which it has been built? I cannot imagine such a situation. The Imperium does not do self-reflection or moral accounting. It simply persists, grinding forward through the centuries on a foundation of acceptable losses and necessary sacrifices. But I remember Cold in Gallery 17 carving symbols into his forearms trying to make sense of what we had witnessed through the fragments of banned philosophy he had somehow encountered. I remember Lowe's trembling hands as he gathered data slates, his face carefully neutral even as something died behind his eyes. I remember the green fire eating the atmosphere of a world, and the silence that followed, and the ash that has never stopped tasting real. I remember these things not because I want to, but because someone needs to. Because the alternative is to let them dissolve into the approved narrative, to become just another paragraph in the official histories, sanitized and justified and rendered harmless by time and distance. I will die soon, in the scale of centuries that imperial institutions measure time by. My augmetics are beginning to fail in ways that cannot be repaired, signs that even rejuvenate technology cannot indefinitely postpone the biological inevitability of dissolution. When I die, my archive will remain, hidden in the data structures of systems that will likely persist long after anyone remembers why they were created. Perhaps someone will find it someday, will piece together the pattern of evidence and testimony, and cross-references into a comprehensive understanding of what the Imperium is and always has been. Perhaps not. It may simply exist, inert and unread, a monument to the futility of bearing witness in a system designed to render witnessing irrelevant. But I had to try, even knowing the probably futility, even understanding that the act of documentation changes nothing and saves no one. I had to believe that the difference between complicit participation and conscious observation matters, that there is value in refusing to forget, even when forgetting would be easier and safer and more comfortable. That somewhere in the machinery of atrocity that grinds forward regardless of individual choice, the simple act of saying, "I saw what happened, and I remember," constitutes a form of resistance, however inadequate. The ash on my tongue is real. It has always been real. It is the taste of Istvan III, carried across centuries and light years, the flavor of a world dying in the service of calculated necessity. I carry it because someone must. Because the alternative is to let the purging become merely another acceptable loss in the endless accounting of imperial survival. And if that happens, if even planetary genocide can be rendered into bland statistics and filed away without acknowledgement of what was sacrificed, then we are truly lost. Then the Imperium has achieved what the Life-Eater virus could only approximate. The complete dissolution not just of biological existence, but of meaning itself. I do not expect redemption or vindication or even understanding. I expect to die with my secrets, to be disposed of with the same bureaucratic efficiency I have witnessed applied to millions of others. But the archive will remain. The documentation will persist. And perhaps, in some future I cannot imagine, someone will find the question that Istvan III represented and try to answer it differently than we did. Perhaps they will find a third path, one that does not require the sacrifice of worlds to the logic of survival. Perhaps they will succeed where we failed, where we could not even conceive of success because the framework of our thinking had been so thoroughly captured by the necessities we served. Or perhaps they will simply add their own testimony to mine, building the archive deeper and wider, creating a record of resistance through the simple act of refusing to forget. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps it has to be enough. Because it is all we have, the stubborn insistence that what happened matters, that the dead deserve to be counted as individuals rather than statistics, that somewhere in the grinding machinery of an Imperium that stretches across the galaxy in 10,000 years, a single human being saying, "I remember, I witnessed, I testify," means something beyond its practical irrelevance. I remember the taste of ash. It is the taste of Istvan III. It is the taste of 10,000 other purges and abandonments and calculated sacrifices. It is the taste of the Imperium itself, of what we are and what we have always been, and I will carry it to my grave, this phantom sensation that the Medicae cannot explain and the Administratum cannot categorize. Because someone must taste what we have consumed in the name of survival. Someone must carry the flavor of our collective damnation, even if it changes nothing. Even if it matters to no one but myself. Even if the archive remains forever sealed and the testimony goes forever unheard. Because I was there. I saw. and I will not forget. That is my service to the Emperor, the only service that feels true after all these years. The service of unwanted memory, of testimony that implicates the witness, of documentation that serves no practical purpose except the moral one of refusing to let atrocity disappear into the comfortable vagueness of historical necessity. I am Credence Vel, and I remember Istvan III. I remember what it tasted like when a world died in service to the Imperium's calculations, and I am not alone.